An 8-year-old girl was found by police tied up and begging for their help. She said that a scary man with green hair had taken her from the family car before telling her, quote, "We killed your mum." This is Red Rum, stories about the true victims of crime. Thelma Boinville was born on the 4th of February 1966 in Brazil and had moved to Hawaii, where she met and married Kevin Emery. They decided to have a baby together, a little girl they called Mukana. Thelma loved children and she actually worked part-time at the local school, Sunset Elementary. As well as this, she worked part-time as a cleaner. Thelma loved the outdoors and was a keen surfer. Generally, her rule was that she wanted to spend as much time outdoors as possible, and she really lived life like that. She'd spend the weekends hanging out with her friends, and despite the small population of where she lived, she had a large group of friends and everyone knew who she was. Thelma had been planning a holiday for herself, her daughter and her husband Kevin, and in the lead up to this vacation, she decided to get in a few hours of extra cleaning work so that she'd have a bit more spending money. On the 7th of December 2017, Thelma was doing her cleaning job, where she was tasked with doing the final touches on an Airbnb in Keihaki Road. She had driven herself and her daughter Mukana to the location, to the Airbnb. She parked up outside and she told Mukana to just wait inside the car. She wouldn't be long, she didn't have a whole lot to do. So she gave Mukana her phone, she loaded up a movie for her to watch, and she left her in the car. And this wasn't unusual, it was considered quite a safe area. This wasn't an unusual thing to do. That way she'd be finished quicker, Mukana would be entertained in the car, and they could leave much quicker than if Mukana came inside with her. At around 3 p.m. that day, the Airbnb was due to be occupied by some Australian tourists. Their check-in time was 3 p.m. and they'd been waiting for that check-in time, so when it came around, they arrived pretty much on the dot. And as they got there, they noticed there was a car parked outside, but they sort of just walked past it and went up to the front door. And this was a kind of check-in where you didn't need to actually physically meet a person. It was a key-coded door, so they had the key code, they entered it, and they went inside the building. The group was shocked to see that the Airbnb in front of them hadn't been cleaned at all. In fact, it seemed it had been intentionally messed with. Things were all out of place, the rooms were in disarray. Something was really, really off. The guests ventured further inside the apartment, and then one of them realised something was definitely wrong, because inside the downstairs area, they found that there were weapons strewn all over the floor and they were bloody. The weapons included a baseball bat, a machete and a meat tenderizer. And just past those weapons, one of the tourists found the body of 51-year-old Thelma Boinville.
Why don't you go ahead and explain to us what you remember seeing?
Okay, I saw a body lying on its stomach. Hands and feet were tied behind the back. And I saw blood.
The group immediately rushed outside to call for help, and as they got outside, they realised that the car that was sitting there just moments earlier had now disappeared. Emergency services were called and they arrived pretty quickly, but it was clear to them straight away that there was nothing they could do. Thelma was dead, and she'd been dead for some time. She had been beaten to death, and her cause of death was multiple blunt force impact trauma and sharp impact trauma. The authorities processed the scene and they found a lot of evidence. They found that the front door was open, they found the blood spatter and all of the weapons, and they also found that there was a small window that was open, and they thought that could possibly have been how the people, the perpetrator or perpetrators, might have gotten into the house. The police needed to clear the scene to make sure that the perpetrator or perpetrators weren't still inside the house, and as they did so, they came across Thelma's 8-year-old daughter, Mukana. Mukana had been tied up by her hands and feet to the bed, and duct tape covered her mouth. Mukana told the officer questioning her that she had been in the car watching that movie on her mum's phone when she'd heard a tapping on the car window. She looked up and she saw a man and woman staring back at her. And then the man, who she described as having big green hair, got her out of the car. He actually dragged her out of the car, and then he told her, quote, "We just killed your mother." He then forced Mukana upstairs and into that bedroom, where he then, with the help of this female accomplice, he then tied her hands up and tied her legs up, tied them to the bed, and then put duct tape on her mouth and left. And it was a few hours later that Makana heard those Australian tourists coming into the house, and then that was soon followed by the police presence. The authorities investigating the scene realised pretty quickly that Thelma's car was missing. Makana had been in it until she was forcibly removed by the man and woman, and the Australian tourists had seen that car outside the Airbnb just before they went in, so it was presumed that the perpetrators had stolen the car and could possibly still be inside. It didn't take authorities long to find the car. It was just parked in a Walmart car park, and they found it, and inside, shockingly to them, the man and woman who fit the description that Makana had given were inside that car. They knew they were the people they were looking for. The police went on to arrest both the man and the woman, and although the woman came quietly, the man did not. He resisted arrest, he tried to fight them off, he shouted at them, and he eventually told them to just shoot him and that he deserved to die. After hearing this, the woman then went on to say that her life wasn't worth living after this day, and asked them to kill her too. Now, as they were arresting this man and woman, the officers saw that the man, they both were covered in blood, but the man had lots of blood on his hands. And so in order to try and preserve evidence, they actually put some paper on his hands and were attempting to sort of block off his hands from contaminating that evidence. But when the man saw what they were doing, he shouted at them, saying he knew exactly what they were trying to do, and then he proceeded to lick the blood on his hands to try and get it off of his hands. The real events of what had happened on that horrific day in Oahu were that Thelma had said goodbye to her daughter, left her in the car with her phone playing that movie, and she reassured her that she wouldn't be long, she'd be back soon. And then she approached the Airbnb, unlocked the door and went inside. But when she got into the first room of the house, she realised that there were already two people there. And she realised pretty quickly that they weren't meant to be there. They weren't the Airbnb customers, and they weren't the homeowners. She knew that these people had probably broken in. The two people in question were 23-year-old Stephen Brown and 20-year-old Hayley Dandurand. And it was true that they had broken into the house just moments before Thelma had arrived. After the brutal attack on Thelma, Stephen and Hayley took Makana out of the car, took her upstairs and tied her to that bed, as we know. And they did actually cover her with a sheet or some sort of fabric, but it seemed a little bit counterproductive because she'd already seen the man and woman and she was able to give really clear, detailed descriptions of them both. Also, they were quite recognisable. Stephen had green hair, which Makana described, and Hayley had pink hair. And so that afternoon, officers called Thelma's husband and told him the devastating news. They also said that they had his daughter and she was safe, but she had experienced some pretty traumatic things. After that, Thelma's brother-in-law had put out an emotional plea video on his social media. He spoke about how unfair it was to have this happen to their beautiful family member and Makana's mum. He's a famous sports person in Hawaii, and he actually offered $100,000 to anyone who could help them find the alleged two perpetrators. Stephen and Hayley had then gone to the local Walmart, and CCTV tracks them going around the store casually shopping for things. And it even shows that when they get to the payment part of that, the woman, Hayley, takes a debit card out of the top pocket on her shirt and she pays for the goods. And then it was later revealed that that credit card wasn't hers, it was Thelma's. Not long after that, they were both found, and Hayley was actually captured by news crews wearing a backpack that was later linked to Makana. She'd stolen that backpack and was wearing it at the time of the arrest, along with a pair of earrings that were later identified as belonging to Thelma. Both Stephen and Hayley pleaded not guilty, and so their cases would go to trial. It was reported just after this incident that Stephen had previously been arrested 11 times, and some of those arrests had been relating to domestic violence. At the time of this arrest, 3 of his criminal charges were still pending, and 2 of those were for domestic violence charges. Stephen couldn't really deny that he wasn't there. There was a lot of evidence saying that he was. He'd even written his name, Axel, or his nickname, Axel, above that door frame. To this day, his Facebook profile name is Axel Hayes Hendricks, and it's what he's known as, certainly by his mum, who put a plea out on Facebook sometime before the murder, saying that she hadn't seen her son in a long time and wanted to find out where he was and if he was okay. Stephen's defence presented that although he had admitted to kidnapping and burglary, he had nothing to do with the actual murder that happened that day. They said that he was out of the room when Thelma was murdered. He testified that he and his then girlfriend Hayley, the other suspect in the case, had been smoking weed when they'd come across this house with an open window. They managed to gain access through that open window as police had suspected, and they got inside and they just started hanging out. He said that was their intention, just to hang out. But then they heard the door opening, and that's when they saw Thelma coming in through the front door. Thelma saw the pair and she told them that they needed to leave. But according to Stephen, Hayley, who at this point was holding a machete, had told Thelma to lay down, and then she demanded that Stephen tie Thelma up. He said that after that he left the room and he went outside. He wanted to check the perimeter to make sure that no one was around. And he added that while he was doing that, whilst he was checking no one was around, all he wanted to do was run away. I'm not quite sure why he wouldn't have run away if he wanted to run away, but that's what he said he wanted to do. He went on to say that when he returned, he could see that Thelma had been hurt. She was lying in a pool of blood and she was bleeding a lot. Quote, "I kind of walk over there and start snapping at Hayley. I was like, what the F did you do?" And after that, Stephen says that he got down on his hands and knees and he actually tried to feel for a pulse. Quote, "I didn't know what I was doing, but I was trying to put her hands on her neck to see if she was coherent. She was unconscious. I was just kind of freaking out. I was just in shock. It was kind of surreal, this was." He says he had no prior knowledge that Hayley had planned to do this until it was too late. He didn't know what they were there to do other than to hang out. And then he went on to say that when he came back into their house and realised what had happened, he was in utter disbelief. He said that Hayley was the one who had showed real determination and focus on just planning out what their next steps were going to be. Although even with that being said, he then went on to admit that even Hayley didn't know what they were going to do next. So after that, they left the house and they went and bought some alcohol, and they just spent the rest of the day getting more and more drunk. So much so that when they were arrested that night in that Walmart car park, they didn't really have any idea what was going on. They didn't have any recollection of it. They said they were so drunk that everything was a bit of a blur. Of course, Hayley said pretty much the same thing in the opposite way. So she said that she had nothing to do with the actual murder. It was all Stephen. She didn't know what he was going to do. She didn't know that he had done it, and she wasn't even in the room when it had happened. She said that she was a victim in all of this. Before meeting Stephen Brown, Hayley, who is originally from Oregon, was attending a community college to study for a liberal arts degree. Her classmates described her as unassuming and kind, but they did say that she started to become more self-isolated over time. In August of 2007, Hayley and Stephen began dating, and she says that she suffered a number of attacks during this 3-month period. Hayley's defence have said that she was not a willing participant in this, and she was under Stephen's abuse and control this entire time. In June of 2020, Hayley was granted a restraining order from Stephen, so he has to stay at least 100 yards away from her. At Stephen's trial, Thelma's daughter, who by this point was 14 years old, actually ended up testifying. She outlined exactly what had happened that day and identified with 100% certainty a photo of Stephen was the man that had been there that day and that had taken her from the car. I've seen it reported elsewhere that McCann also identified Hayley with certainty, but I actually only found that in one source material and it was conflicting with a court document that was reported. So I think we'll just have to wait for Hayley's trial to find out whether that's true or not. The prosecution in Stephen's trial said that blood had been found on Stephen's clothes and not on Hayley's. And they of course brought up the blood that had covered his hands that was found at the time of his arrest that he'd then tried to lick off. They added that Stephen was the one of the pair who would have been able to physically overpower Thelma. Thelma was a very strong, athletic woman, and they say that Stephen was the only one out of him and Hayley who would have been able to overpower her. The jury took less than half a day to decide the verdict, and so on the 19th of January 2023, Stephen was found guilty of murdering Thelma, and he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Hayley's trial, however, isn't scheduled to take place until July of this year. We're in July now, and there's no reporting that has come out about the trial, so we'll have to wait and see as to the sentence she gets if she is convicted. When that does come out, I will make sure to leave a note about it in the show notes, so you check back here in the future for that. By all accounts, it seems that Thelma was not an intended target. She was just in the wrong place at the wrong time with the wrong people. There's no telling what Stephen and Hayley would have done if Thelma hadn't come in at that exact moment. But given their lack of emotion or reasoning for the murder, it's likely that it was only a matter of time before something like this happened. If it wasn't Thelma, it probably would have been someone else in the community. Thank you for watching this episode of Red Rum. If you enjoyed it, please click the thumbs up button. If you enjoy this content, there's a back catalogue of about 50 plus videos on the Red Rum True Crime channel, so check those out. I wanted to recommend one today, which is about a double catfish that went extremely wrong and ended in a murder. I'll leave that linked below if you want to see that. Otherwise, you can just click on the Red Rum True Crime channel and take your pick. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next week for another episode of Red Rum.